What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Enotria, the last song, a Souls-like rooted in Italian folklore. But before we get into that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though as far as this specific game is concerned, there are some, I would say, relatively tedious collection achievements around things like weapons and special abilities. However, if you play through the game multiple times in order to get the different endings, you'll probably pick those up just simply along the way. Otherwise, it's a relatively tame experience, though I'm able to bring you this review just shortly after the game's release because they provided me with a review key prior to the release of the game, so I had a bit of a head start. But that said, it's not a terribly long game anyway, with my first run coming in at a little under 15 hours, like 13 and some change, and that was with a ton of exploration at the same time. The devs had mentioned that they thought the game would take about 40 hours, but I think they might have been referring to how much time it would take to see basically all the endings and everything, because every report I've seen from everybody else in regards to this game also puts it right around the 12 to 15 hour mark, so that's certainly something to know. Now that said, let's talk a little more specifically about the game itself. As I mentioned, a Souls-like rooted in Italian folklore, with an especially large emphasis on theatrics and musical notes to really drive home a very specific aesthetic alongside the environment, which makes for some really beautiful settings to explore and mess around in that unfortunately comes up short in a few other places, such as the game's unique loadout system never really finding its footing, so to speak, at least for me, as one of this game's core mechanics is that you can set up several loadouts for your character that you can swap between on the fly. But ultimately, if you've played a lot of Souls-likes, you'll get the gist here pretty much immediately, as it is a game that plays it fairly safe as far as that genre is concerned. Now from there though, let's talk about the technical state of this one. So the first things that I'd like to mention is that currently you cannot rebind the keys on PC. They are set in stone, which is a huge problem for somebody like myself who really vastly prefers keyboard and mouse, and is what I use to play games even like this. Now, since the game's release, they've already put out a statement that they are working on adding that, so if you're watching this in the future, that might already be sorted out. But it's not the only issue, because this game does have some small stuttering here and there. It wasn't prominent, but definitely popped up every once in a while. And then I also ran into a handful of minor visual stuff, clipping through the walls, enemies getting stuck on the environment, that kind of thing, though. A slightly more prevalent issue that does happen occasionally and can even be forced in some cases is enemies, especially bosses, just kind of freezing up and stopping their movement altogether until you perform an attack that knocks them out of their stance, so to speak. And there was at least one boss I was able to reliably cause that to happen to by simply completely avoiding one of his big wind-up combos. If he performs that and hits nothing but air, doesn't even hit you blocking, anything like that, twice in a row he seemed to freeze up. I was able to make that happen multiple times, and you occasionally even see it happen to smaller non-boss enemies, etc. So there are certainly some technical challenges there, but I will say it's a vast improvement over the demo they initially put out, which had a lot more problems than this one did. Moving right along though, let's talk story setup and everything. So the game starts with a brief introduction to the world. Basically, music is creation here, and it created things to hear music and thus perceive it, and then humans and people later elevated to gods became masters of this music and using it for their creative ends, as art is effectively given the ability to potentially alter the very fabric of reality here. In time, however, that power found its way into the hands of people who simply made a giant set play that everyone was involved in, forcing everyone into a stasis with a set role, which is where our character comes in as a maskless puppet with no role given life, in order to stop this stasis by whatever means necessary. So that's kind of the gist of it as you start moving through it, and this leads naturally to a bunch of different boss fights and a few side quests to get up to and whatnot that you can use to potentially influence which ending you get, but that's a relatively tame thing. Now, one thing I actually did like about this game is that they provide you with a compendium, which is effectively a glossary that keeps track of both things you've encountered, like little enemies, quests and interactions and things you've had along the way. And what I really liked about this compendium is that it both gives you your glossary of terms and everything, but also provides you with what is effectively a quest log, which is something games like this tend to be sorely lacking. And while I can appreciate people trying to say that that is the kind of thing that makes these games mysterious, etc., any game that doesn't keep track of this basic information, I'm just going to write down in a little notebook anyway. And I really do prefer non-invasive approaches to it like this game has, where it's there if you want it, but you don't need to engage with it at all, which was kind of interesting. Now, the game does naturally feature a New Game Plus mode, which you're going to need to complete for the achievements, to be sure. And while it's a fairly basic New Game Plus system, one thing I did actually want to mention here is that they do an interesting thing with the enemy scaling, where the bosses of New Game Plus really aren't that much more difficult than they were the first time around, besides, of course, having a bit more health and damage to keep up with where your character was, but the challenge is about the same. Now, where they have increased something quite a bit is the health of regular enemies has been increased significantly, and they take much longer to kill even with maxed out weapons. And overall, I would say that actually felt pretty good. Bosses didn't become an extremely tedious slog as a result, but it also kept the regular enemies challenging enough to be of note, rather than simply ran past. From there though, let's talk progression systems. So as we are playing this nameless puppet, we will be leveling up in typical Souls-like fashion by collecting memoria from our fallen enemies, which acts as our souls in this Souls-like, and thus it is our currency and experience. We spend this experience at our checkpoints in order to increase certain attributes, but these attributes are more like archetypes that a character might have, such as Bruiser or Battle Mage, but ultimately they are simply attributes that increase secondary stats as a result, and then weapon scaling occurs based off of that. So each weapon you pick up and find has stats associated with it, and it scales off of either like attack power or ardor, or like the magic basically, which are technically secondary stats, but the assassin attribute, as an example, increases attack power, which would then obviously help out weapons that scale off of that. Speaking of weapons though, gear and your loadouts here play a pretty big role in progression. Now basically everything I'm about to mention to you can be assigned to one of 3 different loadouts. So you can gear out and customize 3 separate loadouts that you can then hot swap between in the middle of combat, or just, during traversal or whatever floats your boat, which is important because that's the only time you can change a lot of this stuff outside of a checkpoint, which is important to know. Now first up we have our mask. This dictates the physical appearance of your character and comes with some sort of benefit or detriment. You'll collect these potentially just by killing enough regular enemies or defeating certain bosses. Then there are your aspects or roles. This is a customizable option that allows you to make stat adjustments to your base stats. Some of them are basic and just provide a moderate bonus to one in particular, whereas others are more extreme in the sense that they provide very large bonuses to one attribute while being detrimental to other attributes. So there is a little bit of play there in terms of which attributes you are increasing via this. But then we have our perks and our lines. So perks come from a separate progression system called the Path of Innovators, 4 separate little skill trees that we spend points we acquire by filling out our compendium in order to obtain. These perks can then be assigned to several perk slots associated with each loadout that will allow you to focus on a specific aspect of combat that you particularly enjoy. Though I will say parry seems to be the easiest way to go, as you can expand it and make it easier to time, but also because it staggers enemies greatly as compared to other things that just give your skills more power, but have to be charged up in order to be made use of, which is where the lines come in. Lines are effectively your abilities or skills. You're going to find a ton of these as you move through the game, and each of them has stat requirements and things in order to be equipped. But as you hit enemies, these abilities will charge, and then you can unleash them, of course, which can then also use your perks to grant you extra effects. So if you, say, cast the first slot, you might have a perk that then activates a secondary ability because you used the ability from your first slot for your abilities, which can be a little bit confusing, which is why, honestly, I preferred things like just bumping up the parry system, because it got a little tedious to be remembering which ability I needed to use when to make the most of that. Now, while I did like the idea at play here, I did find myself rarely using the loadout system because it just isn't terribly necessary. Most bosses don't really seem to be designed with it in mind. Now, if I had to guess, the goal here was that there are certain elemental status effects in the game, and some enemies have elemental defenses against these statuses, and you could use your perks to activate one of those elemental effects on yourself or your weapon. And so maybe they wanted you to swap between loadouts to deal with those elemental status effects and defenses appropriately, but you could also just ignore that entirely and focus on physical damage, which nothing really seems to stop. And so the only time I really found myself using the loadout system was simply to try out different build ideas as I played through the game normally, rather than actually using it as a combat mechanic, as again, it just simply wasn't necessary in any way. Now the last bit of progression though is your upgrades. So there are occasionally anvils and things to be found throughout the game, and you can use these to upgrade your weapons, your skills, and your masks, which obviously just increases their effects. For weapons, this increases how well they scale off of certain attributes, increasing your damage. Masks will have their effect enhanced, and the same thing with lines, they'll charge up faster and deal more damage. So it's a pretty basic upgrade system. From there though, let's talk gameplay and world of this one. So the world of Enotria, if you will, is divided primarily up into 3 different areas. The starter area, which is relatively short, and then the 2 follow-up areas, which are much larger, but all of them attempt to recreate that sort of interconnected world feeling that you often see in this genre, which naturally means things like our checkpoints or bonfires, where we can rest, which resets enemies, but also allows us to do things like level up or swap out our loadouts. However, when we do that, not everything is necessarily reset, such as shortcuts we've unlocked or gates we've opened, ladders we've kicked down to access other areas, etc. And you can use that to, say, either farm enemies for experience or simply make traversal easier as you're tracking down leads for certain little quests, and other notable things. Speaking of those quests though, there are a handful. I wouldn't say it's a lot. The game just simply isn't long enough to support many of them, so a lot of them are very easy to find. But a short ways into the game, you get access to this theater that sort of acts as your main hub, and if you follow some instructions from characters you'll meet there, they'll basically tell you roughly where to find everyone else, which then leads you into those quests for you to track down and find, which is all tracked in your compendium, so they're not terribly difficult to figure out. Now, another interesting bit of the gameplay and world, though, is the rift system. So your character will occasionally find rifts, and interacting with them changes the environment in some way. Now, basic rifts, this basically just conjures up typically a timed platform, though in some cases it is permanent until you move out of the area, such as a bridge, etc., which aids in traversal, and sometimes they make little puzzles out of this, so you can get to the reward on the other end. Now then there are combat rifts. These are rifts you are stuck in until you defeat the enemies that show up after you activate them, and sometimes this can include even boss fights and whatnot, but for the most part it's usually like smaller enemies that defeating them leads you to a reward of some sort, which is usually weapons, a skill line, a skill, an aspect, etc. Now you can fast travel from your checkpoints pretty much right away, but it's worth a mention that each of these areas is genuinely as entirely separate loaded area from the others, so in order to reach the new ones, initially you'll have to go to a place that facilitates fast travel between them, just as an aside. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the meat of the game here, which is combat. Now, I would say this is where you can tell the game is more of a AA experience by far, as there's certainly a fair bit of jank involved here. And while it has its fun moments, I do think it drops the ball in a couple places, especially with those loadouts or things like elemental status effects, because they do interesting stuff, but it's just not quite fleshed out enough. And I think one of the easiest ways to explain that is actually with weapon speed and recovery times. So I would recommend most people play this with a faster weapon. Slower two-handed weapons are a huge problem, mainly because of smaller enemies that can hit you with something like an arrow, but by the time your character recovers and you regain control of your movement from that attack, they're already attacking you again, which means unless you parry perfectly immediately or manage to immediately get out of the way, you're going to get hit again. And that's fine with one enemy, but they like to double these characters up, which means you can effectively get stun locked because the recovery time from the hits on these characters and when they attack again is like right on that line. And as such, if you're using a big bulky two-handed weapon, in those situations you're unlikely to get a hit in at all, and thus it feels really terrible using those weapons. And this is another reason the parrying system works out so well, especially with the perks that widen the window at which you can parry successfully, you can just simply block all of those attacks and then make your counterattacks, and eventually you'll fill up the unraveling meter. So enemies have what is effectively a stun bar, or an unraveling bar, that if you hit them enough, they'll eventually go into a stunned state, at which point you can unleash a big devastating hit on them that deals a ton of damage. Several bosses, I would say, are designed around this, but it's also in effect on weaker enemies as well. Now, hitting an enemy will charge this, but so will parrying them, which means that if you get good at this and you have the perks to expand upon that, it becomes really easy to perfectly parry bosses until their stun meter gets charged up, at which point you can unleash a big devastating blow and just simply take them out, which really just outstripes every other form of combat, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, as you're hitting enemies, like I mentioned, you will be charging up attacks and everything, and then you can use those special abilities. Now, my problem with this is if you take basically any hit while using those abilities, it immediately gets canceled, and you lose the charge on it. So I didn't usually find that worthwhile for all but the strongest lines and abilities, which I would then use at opportune moments. Also, as I mentioned earlier, some of those abilities and lines can be used to activate special effects via perks that you can assign to your character, such as using ability in slot 1 activates this effect with this other elemental thing. And that's kind of how you can play a more spellcaster-oriented build, but even that can be tricky because of the elemental system, which has an interesting concept on the face of it, but because it also applies to enemies can be difficult to work around. Basically, there are several different elements in the game, and if you hit enemies with them enough, it stacks an effect, or on you, vice versa. But the catch here is that all of those status effects have a benefit and a detriment. It usually strengthens you in one way while making you weak in another, such as increasing your stamina regeneration but causing you to take more damage. One of them heals you really quickly but can also get you one shot if you're not careful. Now the catch to that is when you're using that against certain enemies, they will also get that benefit versus detriment treatment, which means you have to be aware of that and understand how to capitalize on it if that's the build style you want to play with, which is inherently just more complicated than simply parrying everything to death. So all things are not created equal. Also, just as an aside here, I did notice throughout the game that a lot of enemies share like the same basic moveset as you move through areas. Not all of them, mind you, but you can kind of tell that there are certain categories of enemies here because different enemies in different portions of the game will use like the exact same attack patterns, which actually winds up making parrying even easier because you know kind of what the general tempo of any given character's attack is going to be once you realize that. But that brings me to the Steam Deck section before we wrap this one up. So on the Steam Deck side of these things, actually works pretty great. Controller support, obviously, cloud saves. The game runs pretty well here. Only thing I really had to do is tweak some of the graphical settings and cause it to use like frame generation to help smooth out the FPS, as it could be a little choppy when I first fired it up. But other than that, it was a pretty good experience. Now, if I had to guess though, it'll probably wind up with an official playable rating simply because the text on the menus is really quite small. And while I personally hate playing games like this with a controller, I do think that will be a viable option for some people, so definitely noteworthy. Now, let's talk positives and negatives. On the positive side of things, for me, it was definitely the world, the art, the aesthetic of this game, the sort of sinister whimsy of it all. And honestly, just exploring some of those environments and fighting off these enemies as you do it and playing around with that rift system, I had a lot of fun just exploring this world. And the combat, while I wouldn't call it great, is serviceable enough to make that a little more compelling at the same time. Now, on the negative side of things, I wouldn't say there's any like big glaring negatives, but rather there's a lot of little things that start to add up over time, such as, for instance, the game not launching with keybinds is obviously a huge negative to somebody like myself who uses keyboard and mouse, but there's also that stuff with the enemies and their attack pacing, which makes using any kind of slower weapon feel awful to actually play around with. The elemental system and how it engages with certain ability slots can be kind of annoying to navigate. The loadout system itself doesn't feel like they really made a lot of practical use of it, despite it being one of the main selling points of a game like this. As personally, I thought they would, implement a boss or two that had like different phases where you would want to swap loadouts because their like attack pattern changed and you wanted to capitalize on that in some way, but that doesn't really ever happen. And for a game that feels like it is almost designed for second phase boss fights, it just doesn't happen. So let's pull all of that together for a conclusion. So my conclusion for Enotria is that I would say it's a very solid AA Souls-like, but it's otherwise kind of unremarkable. And that's a bit of an issue for a genre that has honestly a lot of releases regularly. We get Souls-likes all the time. So when we see one that also has a fairly large price tag for what these smaller Souls-likes tend to run, of $50 US, and naturally whatever that is regionally, you've got a game that's a bit of a hard sell. So I would say very generally, if you love Souls-likes and you plan on playing through this game more than once, to, see everything and do everything, then I think it can justify that $50 price tag. However, for the vast majority of people who are only going to play through this game one time, which isn't going to take very long, and you're certainly going to encounter janky systems along the way, I'd simply have to give it a buy on sale for those, which is exactly what I'm doing. Which is as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it, found it informative, gave you all the information you wanted about this particular title, but certainly let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.